Hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah chaka, hookah, hookah, hookah.
Before the French imperialized Vietnam, it was a peaceful place ruled by local dynasties. The French came in for economic exploitation, covered by religious motive, attempting to assimilate the people to French culture, which they were not fond of. Vietnam was later left locked in civil war, resulting in the two halves we saw during the Vietnam War. Today, it has still only managed to somewhat recover.
Vietnam is located in both the eastern and southern hemispheres, and is positioned in Southeast Asia, a recognized geographical region of the Asian continent. Vietnam is bordered by the Pacific Ocean, Gulf of Tonkin, Gulf of Thailand, South China Sea, and the countries of China and Laos, and Cambodia. Vietnam had a population of 52,074,766 in 1979. Vietnam is 127,244 square miles, which is a bit smaller than California. But as you can see, Vietnam is considerably longer.
Vietnam has also been known as Xuai Choi, Ao Loc, Nam Viet, Gao Chi, Van Xuan, Annam, Dai Viet, Dai Nhu, Dai Nam, Empire of Vietnam, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Viet, State of Vietnam South, Republic of Vietnam South, Socialist Republic of Vietnam North.
The basic nature of Vietnamese society changed little during the 10th through 19th century. After their independence from China, Vietnam fell into 1,000 years of different dynasties controlling different sections of the state. One king would place a governor at the north, central, and southern areas of Vietnam. These sections would remain visible while imperialized under the French, and eventually would lead to the separation of the north and south. During the time of dynasties, literacy in Vietnam remained in the upper class until the French put schools in the south.
Concerned with the population's lack of knowledge of Vietnam under the French, our heroes decided to travel back in time and document some of the people's experiences. Aided by a mad scientists, they travel back periodically, starting with 1859. The time travel machine they will be using is known as the Lytle Tix 2000.
We are here in Vietnam, 1859, and we just intercepted two letters, one from Hoang Cao Khai to Phan Dinh Phung, and another one that came from Phan Dinh Phung to Hoang Cao Khai. This one explains how Hoang is welcoming to the French and he is ready for their imperialism. Not excited, but he is not willing to go to war, knowing how powerful they are.
I venture to predict that should you pursue with your struggle, not only will the population of our village be destroyed, but our entire country will be transformed into a sea of blood and a mountain of bones.
And this letter is from Phan Dinh Phung, and he is explaining to Hoang that China has attempted so many times to annex Vietnam but has failed, so why should the French be any different?
In the past, the Han, the Song, the Yuan, and the Ming time, and again, dreamt of annexing our country and of dividing it up into prefectures and districts within the Chinese administrative system, but never were they able to realize their dream.
It is safe to assume that both of these letters are biased. Hoang is a scholar from a small village, and he would be against the revolution because a lot of people would die and then he'd lose a lot of credit in his society. But Phung is not a scholar. He is a general and ready for rebellion against the French, knowing that the Vietnamese are very strong people, very dedicated to their country. The Nguyen dynasty divided the country of Vietnam into three regions, the south, the center, and the north, and placed a royal governor at the head of each region and maintained an unfiled undefined administration. When the French took over, they maintained the same territorial division, apparently not for the same purposes, but gave each region a different administrative status in accordance with their objective divide and rule. The South became a colony directly governed by the French, while the center and the north were French protectorates. The Vietnamese emperor was given some authority over the central, but no real power. North and central Vietnam, the French used the tactic of protectorate as their type of imperialism, where they just protected that area instead of trying to envelop it in its culture. In South Vietnam, the French used an imperialization tactic called assimilation, where you take the culture of one country and attempt to change it all up into your own culture. Imperialism, however, was the cause of the separation between the North and the South. The French tried to assimilate the South in its culture because it had more access to the water and there was more opportunities for trade. The French set protectorates on Central and North Vietnam because it was less valuable, because there was more jungle and less farmland.
Why did your country imperialize Vietnam?
We imperialized Vietnam for economic growth, the spread of Christianity, and the necessity of a place of protection and an area to reload fuel.
What is your country doing to the people here? What makes you justified in this situation?
The French changed and seized land from landowners and demanded that they work on large rice and rubber plantations. We are justified because we are spreading Catholicism and we are advancing this backwards nation. I know that a very smart man named Jules Ferry gave us a very good reason, and it is all true. At present, as you know, a warship, however perfect its design, cannot carry more than 2 weeks' supply of coal. And a vessel without coal is a wreck on the high seas, abandoned to the first occupier. Hence the need to have places of supply, shelters, and ports for defense and provisioning. And that is why we needed Tunisia, that is why we needed Saigon and Indochina, and that is why we need Madagascar, and why we shall never leave them.
This speech is proof that the people in France saw that there was a need beyond religious motive. There was a reason for the French to stay in Vietnam for a refueling station. The French needed a place for explorers to refuel. French colonialism did provide some benefits for Vietnamese society, one of the more noticeable of which was education. French missionaries, officials, and their families opened primary schools conducting lessons in both the French and Viet languages. The University of Hanoi was opened by colonists in 1902 and became an important national center of learning. A small quota of Viet students were given scholarships to study in France, but these changes were really only significant in the cities. There was little or no attempts to educate the children of peasant farmers, and the syllabuses at these schools reinforced the colonial control by stressing the supremacy of French values and culture. Colonialism also produced a physical transformation in Vietnamese cities. Traditional local temples, monuments, and houses, some of which had stood for a millennium, were declared derelict and destroyed. Buildings of French architecture and style were erected in their place. The Vietnamese names of cities, towns, and streets were changed to French names. Significant businesses tended to be conducted in French rather than the local languages. If not for the climate and people, some parts of Hanoi and Saigon could have been mistaken for parts of Paris than a Southeast Asian capital.
What you just witnessed was Can Vong, which translates to loyalty to the king, a guerrilla warfare organization. They attacked French soldiers. Although they never managed to become a widespread revolution, this military force, with their guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the jungle, proved to be a militaristic annoyance for the French. We will give our camera to one of the attacking members of the forces.
Emperor Ton That Thuyen started this revolution, this movement called Con Vong, which means loyalty to the king, or loyalty to him.
We have been forced to flee the French and now live in great shame. With one united mind, body, and spirit we shall resist. All Vietnamese shall fight back. Do you fear death more than you love your country? Will you live under the shadows of the French, or will you join us? Come and live in the jungle, obey your righteous appeal for freedom. Perhaps with heaven's assistance, we shall be able to turn chaos into order, danger into peace, and finally retrieve our entire country.
This is an example of how the French treated the imperialized Vietnamese and what their labor brought them. Profit, not politics, was the real driving factor behind the French colonization of Indochina. Colonial officials and French companies transformed Vietnam's thriving subsistence economy into a proto-capitalist system. Based on land ownership, increased populations, exports, and low wages, millions of Vietnamese no longer work to provide themselves. They now work for the benefit of their French overlords. The French seized vast swaths of land and reorganized them into plantations. Small landholders were given the option of remaining as laborers on these plantations or relocating somewhere else. Where there were labor shortfalls, Viet farmers were recruited en masse from outlying villages. Sometimes they came voluntarily, lured by false promises of high wages. Sometimes they were conscripted at the point of gun. Rice and rubber were the main cash crops of these plantations. The amount of land used for growing rice almost quadrupled in the 20 years after 1880. While Cochin, China, southern Vietnam, had 25 gigantic rubber plantations by the 1930s, Indochina was supplying 60,000 tons of rubber each year, 5% of the total global production. The French had also constructed factories and built mines to tap into Vietnam's deposit of coal, tin, and zinc. Most of this material was sold abroad as exports, and most of the profits lined the pockets of French capitalists, investors, and officials.
The French did not treat these Vietnamese people well. As all Europeans saw it, if you weren't from Europe, then you're worthless and not important to society. We're now going to jump to the early 1920s, where we will hopefully intercept some of Ho Chi Minh's early writings. This is a document by Ho Chi Minh called The Civilizer, which explains how abusively the French treated regular working-class Vietnamese people.
An old Annamese woman, also a salt carrier, had an argument with a woman overseer regarding the stoppage of part of her wages. On hearing the overseer's complaint, the officer, without more ado, took it upon himself to give the carrier 2 stinging slaps in the face. While the poor woman was stopping to pick up her hat, the civilizer, not satisfied with the slaps he had just given her, furiously kicked her in the lower abdomen, immediately provoking a great flow of blood.
Ho Chi Minh's observations were capturing a biased side. I can imagine that the French believe that they are justified in this situation. Based off Ho Chi Minh's statement, we can assume that the working class in Vietnam treated far worse than this woman in the marketplace.
When France was liberated, Japan took control of Indochina. The U.S. was still supporting the Viet Minh at Yatla and again at Potsdam. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin decided the fate of post-war Indochina. It was agreed that Vietnam would be partitioned into North and South until order was restored, with an ultimate goal of reunification. The nationalist Chinese were to occupy the North and the British would occupy the South. Nobody told the French or Vietnamese. When Japan surrendered, the Yatla Potsdam plans were put into effect. Ho, Giap, and Viet Minh learned how they had been stabbed in the back by the U.S. The result was a massive influx of nationalist Vietnamese into the Viet Minh in the North and in the South. France was demanding its empire back.
After the Japanese surrendered in 1945 to the Allies, Ho Chi Minh wrote a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, which included, "We are convinced that the Allied nations, which at Tehran and San Francisco have acknowledged the principles of self-determination and equality of nations, will not refuse to acknowledge the independence of Vietnam. A people who have courageously opposed French domination for more than 8 years. A people who have fought side by side with the Allies against the fascists during these last years. Such a people must be free and independent. For these reasons, we, members of the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, solemnly declare to the world that Vietnam has the right to be free and independent country, and in fact so already. The entire Vietnamese people are determined to mobilize all their physical and mental strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and their liberty." After being imperialized for years and years, they had a moment alone. With no Japanese or French imperialists, Ho Chi Minh took this opportunity to prove to the world that Vietnam was its own independent, powerful nation that can take better care of itself than any other nation ever could. In October of 1945, the French returned to South Vietnam and drove out the North's forces from Saigon. The French called for Britain and the U.S. to aid in the war against the North or Viet Minh forces in the 1950s. Civil war happening during this time was against South Vietnam and the Western world, and the North and China, who was pro-communism.
In 1946, the British were having enough trouble trying to get from under the Palestine Mandate, so they turned to South Vietnam over to the French. The U.S. agreed more nationalists joined the Viet Minh. Mao defeated Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalist Chinese were removed from the equation. Mao supported the Viet Minh under Howe and Giap, who were by now revered heroes and freedom fighters throughout North and South Vietnam. The Viet Minh had become extremely capable guerrilla fighters. With Chinese aid, they acquired the capability to fight a conventional war. They defeated the French in Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
After a 20-year war with Britain, France, United States, and South Vietnam against North Vietnam and China, it ended with the North succeeding. In 1975, the Vietnamese were the first people to defeat the United States and create a communist nation. They used guerrilla warfare. Since the United States had never been to the North, it gave the Vietnamese a strategic advantage that helped them win the war. The Vietnam War was a result of the French leaving Vietnam during World War II and returning immediately after to reclaim territory that was not theirs. During the war in Vietnam, Major General Nguyen Nguyen Hinh wrote a report based on what he saw from a Southern perspective. He also wrote about French imperialism and how it affected both sides of the war. Early exposure to French culture enabled more Southerners to speak French and learn French ways. It also made their naturalization process much easier. A new class, therefore, emerged in Cochin China, which was made up of people in the French employ or having business relations with French and large landowners, benefiting from the French land development program of 1880 to 1939. These landowners eventually became the first indigenous bourgeoisie capitalists of the whole country, with their favored treatment of this new rising class and their development to win friends among Southerners by favorite policies. The French managed to reinforce the spirit of regionalism that had been latent among the Vietnamese. The changes in traditional Vietnamese society came out partially as a result of French influence. While some of these changes were part of the systematic design, others were more important, came naturally from the context with Western civilization and ideologies. It was this initiation to the Western world that spawned indigenous political parties and their tendencies struggle against French rule. These included both Vietnamese nationalist parties and Indo-Chinese Communist parties, ICP. This statement is biased because he grew up in a culture of the French. Since they assimilated the South, he probably didn't know a life that was not somewhat westernized or influenced by the French culture in some way.
In conclusion, Vietnam was imperialized by France from 1859 to 1975, and when the Vietnam War ended. Due to the state of Vietnamese government, the country is united under communist rule. Imperialism by the French benefited the southern part of Vietnam, where even today you cannot visit the south without noticing the buildings look like European-style architecture. The French businessmen gained workers from rice plantations and controlled at least 5% of the world's production of rice. The French saw Vietnam as a place of resources and a place for their warships and explorers to stop and refuel.
The French, much like all Europeans, used the citizens of Vietnam for their own personal gain. Some Vietnamese, like Ho Chi Minh, recognized this abuse and needed to put a stop to it. When World War II began, French pulled out of Vietnam, and it was immediately imperialized by the Japanese.
At the end of the war, France returned to Vietnam, which caused a war that, when ended, would give Vietnam the new government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and a new era of communism. After our time travel, we've decided that maybe you do know more about Vietnam, and we're going to now jump back to the future where we can hopefully... Well, good thing the French imperialized Vietnam. So that they're...